Hello, this is Camilla Elliott. I'm Professor of Literature and Media in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. And I have made a three-part playlist that discusses Wuthering Heights, the making of a classic. This playlist is designed for advanced secondary school students. Part 1, and this is part 1, looks at early reviews of Wuthering Heights. Part 2 looks at later criticism, and Part 3 at adaptations of Wuthering Heights. And all three ask the question of how these do or do not construct Wuthering Heights as a classic. Now, by classic, I don't necessarily mean something unquestioned and brilliant. I mean something that a culture decides is a classic for a variety of reasons. Let's begin by looking at what the dictionary says a classic is. The first definition is of the first class, of the highest rank or importance. And this is based in a tradition that comes from canonical, sacred, theological, religious texts, and it carried into English literature in the 18th and 19th centuries and was used to apply to canonical, sacred texts that are, like the Bible or other sacred texts, supposed to be improving and moral and building of an individual and also of a society. Another slightly more modest definition is an acknowledged standard or model on which others base their work. A third is that a classic endures beyond the moment of its making and its initial reception, and it lasts, it has ongoing interest and value. And finally, archetypal. This would be having certain kinds of characters and plots that have mythological significance that might apply to many different cultures and time periods, or might find resonance in many different periods and times and cultures. So that's just a baseline definition, but of course a lot of people have talked about how classics are something that serves the interests of the people that create the lists, usually the higher classes, the ruling classes, dominant people in any given society. And we will be looking at how criticism has been changing and views of what a classic is have been changing. Wuthering Heights was published, as you know, in 1847. Emily Bronte used the pseudonym Ellis Bell, and it wasn't a classic to begin with. Early reviews were absolutely horrified by it. Here's one from the Atlas. It should have been called Wuthering Heights, for anything from which the mind and body could more instinctively shrink than the mansion and its inhabitants cannot be imagined. Graham's Lady magazine writes, how a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors. Now, I'd like you to do an activity right now. I'd like you to look at these two paragraphs, sentences really, a couple of sentences in one, and I want you to see if you can close read the language and decide what kinds of values, what were they expecting it to be? What would a novel that they praised have been like? If you're on your own, sit down and do some writing and thinking. If you're with other people, have a discussion. So pause the video, do this activity, and then when you're ready, press play and continue. Okay, so the first one, the idea that a novel should give you some kind of pleasure or should draw you in rather than make you feel shut out and shrinking from it. So that's the idea, that it should be something you can identify, you can relate to. This isn't. But the second one has a lot more going in that couple of sentences. The idea that what you do is you take the words vulgar depravity, what are the opposites of those words? Civilized morality, and then unnatural horrors, natural realism perhaps. The idea that they're looking for morals, They're looking for something that will elevate and civilize them in a novel, something that feels natural, recognizable, realistic, and certainly not something that's horrific, something that may have sorrow in it, may have challenges in it, but would be more of an everyday society type of publication. So now have a go at this slide here. This slide has people who have mixed feelings about the book. They still condemn it, but there is something about it that is drawing them. The Examiner writes, "This is a strange book. It is not without evidences of considerable power, but as a whole it is wild, confused, disjointed and improbable. And the people who make up the drama, which is tragic enough in its consequences, are savages ruder than those who lived before the days of Homer." Douglas Jerrold's weekly newspaper also describes Wuthering Heights as a strange sort of book, baffling all regular criticism. I love that because it's like the critics don't know what to do with it because it's so strange and so out of the ordinary. Yet it is impossible, the writer says, to begin and not finish it, and quite as impossible to lay it aside afterwards and say nothing about it. In the midst of the reader's perplexity, the ideas predominant in his mind concerning this book are likely to be brutal cruelty and semi-savage love. What may be the moral which the author wishes the reader to deduce from his work? It's difficult to say, and we refrain from assigning any because, to speak honestly, we've discovered none but mere glimpses of hidden morals or secondary meanings. There seems to us great power in this book, but a purposeless power, which we feel a great desire to see turned to better account. We are quite confident that the writer of Wuthering Heights wants but the practiced skill to make a great artist, perhaps a great dramatic artist. So here is another place for you to pause the video and write down or discuss what you think is affecting these people, what is drawing them, what it is they don't like, what it is that fascinates them. And then when you're ready, go ahead and press play again. So both of the reviewers use the word strange, so it's not familiar, it's unusual, and both of them use the word power, considerable power. There is something that is attracting them and yet at the same time turning them off. This is a lot like Heathcliff, really. So the first one doesn't want it to be wild, confused, disjointed. It wants more organization. You've got loads of different narrators and different points of view in this book. And they also don't feel it's very probable. It's not realistic to them. And the biggest criticism is how savage the characters in the book are. The idea, again, that literature should be civilizing, ennobling, showing progress, and the fact that it's set in the 19th century rather than in the past is just so shocking. There isn't a whole body of literature about psychopaths and serial killers and so on to have made this book familiar at that time. So the second critic, I think, is also kind of baffled, absolutely compelled by the book, can't put it down, has to say something, but this reader cannot find the morals. They're used to looking for morals, and in some ways quite humbly saying, I'm not quite sure that I've been able to find any. And they want the power of the book to be harnessed to conventional morality, to have a purpose, to see that power turned to better account. And then somewhat patronizingly, keep practicing, you'll someday be a great artist, and perhaps you'll be better at writing for the stage maybe than for novels, because there you can get away with a bit more melodrama, you can have some slightly more scandalous characters and so on. One more, Dante Rossetti, very famous Pre-Raphaelite painter, also a poet, and certainly not a conventional morally based type of Victorian. He writes to his friend William Allingham, I've been greatly interested in Wuthering Heights, the first novel I've read for an age, and the best as regards power and sound style for two ages. So here again, we have someone who doesn't really like novels, probably because they are so conventional and moralistic, finding the power, but he likes the style. He doesn't mind that it's disjointed and that it has multiple narrators. But, he says, it is a fiend of a book, an incredible monster. That's not Heathcliff's a fiend or a monster, but the book itself is a fiend or a monster. And then, somewhat troublingly, combining all the stronger female tendencies, this idea that some of the passion and the unruliness and the savagery is a kind of female tendency. Then he talks of the setting. The action is laid in hell, not Yorkshire, only it seems places and people have English names there. This sense of this as a diabolical novel. One of the things that troubled a lot of readers was the fact it was set in Yorkshire not too long ago. There were loads of Gothic novels at this time from the late 18th century well into the middle of the 19th century. And these were generally set in foreign countries hundreds of years ago. People could handle tyrannical Gothic patriarchs. They could handle rapacious, violent, murderous monks as long as they weren't English, as long as they weren't British. There's this larger context in which readers want to think of themselves as civilized, their society is civilized, and it really irks them when novels are written about English people that don't live up to their idea of good and evil, or even the neat parcels of good and evil. Let's think now a little bit about the novel. Let's remind ourselves of the things in the novel that triggered these concerns, even with someone as open-minded as Dante Rossetti. Isabella asks Nellie, is Mr. Heathcliff a man? Is he the devil? There's a sense of him as not really being human, or not human in a humanist way, in a humane way. Let's look at some of the things that characterize Heathcliff. First of all, there are connotations of incest with Cathy. Now, there's a whole line of speculation that Heathcliff is the illegitimate son of Earnshaw, and that's why he brought him home. There isn't any proof for that, but even without that proof, the fact that they're being raised from childhood as brother and sister, and that Heathcliff develops this absolutely monomaniacal passion, and it is a physical passion, a passion to possess and to own Cathy, is somehow disturbing. Now, I should say that Cathy herself is also disturbing, as are many of the characters. Her angry, abusive, drunken, gambling brother Hindley, his rather rough son Hareton, Joseph, who's a rather savage and moralistic person, Cathy herself, wild, peevish, selfish, out of control. But Heathcliff takes the cake in terms of the diabolical. Instead of helping Hindley to overcome his drinking and gambling problem, as a moral Victorian man would do, he actually eggs him on in order to have him self-destruct so he can take over his property. He corrupts and degrades Hindley's son Hareton, and relishes the fact that the boy is especially sensitive, because he relishes the fact that he will suffer all the more for that corruption and that degradation, and he will feel it all the more keenly. In the same way, he abuses Isabella after he marries her, and he says, the more the worms writhe, the more I yearn to crush the entrails. There is definitely a sadistic angle and aspect to Heathcliff. And when they elope, he and Isabella elope, the last thing he does is he takes her precious lapdog and he hangs it. The dog's rescued, but that's not the point. That's an incredibly malicious, sadistic thing to do, and it's also very brutal to take such a small and helpless and defenseless animal, just as it was really troubling that he is corrupting and degrading and abusing the little boy, Hareton. If you're thinking, well, he loves Cathy so much, that redeems him, remember the scene where he slaps her and beats her. Here's the passage where he's holding her and delivering a shower of terrific slaps on both sides of the head. This is very much like the abusive relationships that we read about all the time today in the news and documentaries and so on. And he's not sorry afterwards. A lot of abusers will apologize so they can inaugurate another cycle, but he doesn't feel, and he would do it again. And he feels she deserved it and she should be spanked as a naughty child. He digs up Kathy's coffin, or digs down towards it, with a goal of committing necrophilia, embracing her corpse. He takes her other afterlife, her young daughter Catherine, away from her father, who loves her and treats her tenderly, and traps her, locks her, imprisons her in his home, and forces her to marry his son to avoid scandal. Very much a Gothic patriarch imprisoning the heroine in order to gain property and power. In these cases, that Gothic patriarch does not desire the young heroine for himself. It's a purely mercenary thing, and this allows him eventually to secure Edgar's estate as well as Hindley's. So remember all these things as you go on to part 2, which looks at how later criticism sanitizes the novel and the things that have shocked early readers. And then after that, there's part 3, the making of a classic. Thank you very much for watching, listening, and participating in this workshop. If you're interested in learning more about what it's like to study English literature or creative writing or both at university, take a look at our website and do feel free to contact us with any questions.